afternoon, everyone. It's hard to believe we're down to the last session. If everybody turn to your workbook to page 65. We have a little story here. It's entitled Loving God, Loving Others Case Study. And kind of our goal with this is that this is a little story that our staff team at Fresh Start and the staff at Deeper Life have kind of put together. And this story is nobody we know. It's a story that we thought this would be maybe something that we could experience. Some of this might be an actual happening that could happen to some of us or experience. And so how can we apply some of the things that we've learned the last 3 days to this story? And we have some questions here. And what I'd like to do is you all heard us talk, and so now I'd like to hear from you all. So probably my goal here would be we have 6 questions here. I'd maybe like to get out of the audience maybe 2 or 3 volunteers for each question to come up here and give your thoughts about that question related to this story. So be brave. This isn't this is discussion and learning. So there's not a right or wrong answer here. If we go with the scriptures, what can we learn? So I'm going to read this story, and then we'll look at the first question. I'll ask for volunteers. Frank was born and raised in an Anabaptist home and is a hardworking and self-sufficient man. Laura was raised in a non-Anabaptist home by a controlling father. She has 2 sisters and is the oldest. Frank and Laura have been married for 20 years and have 5 children. Frank owns a construction business. Laura is a homemaker. Frank and Laura are members at a Mennonite church. Frank built a pole barn for a member of a neighboring Mennonite church. Frank has not been paid for the job for 2 years. Frank has become increasingly angry about the situation. Laura notices that Frank is increasingly irritated at small things and quickly angry with the children. Laura fears for her and Frank's relationship. Laura fears talking to Frank about it because of the anger it stirs up and the tensions it creates. Laura feels herself withdrawing some from Frank. Laura encourages Frank to talk to his pastor about the situation, but Frank feels he can resolve it on his own. Laura feels rejected as a result of Frank's anger and fears it will destroy relationships in the neighboring church where the man who didn't pay Frank attends. Laura values those relationships, but at the same time loves and is concerned about Frank. Laura confides in her fears to the pastor's wife. The pastor comes and talks with Frank about the situation. Frank feels exposed and shamed by the fact that someone came to talk to him about it. The pastor carefully listens to Frank's story and gives Frank some biblical steps he can take to help the situation. The pastor assures Frank he will walk with him through the conflict. So this is our story. And we purposely left some of the details out, didn't give a lot of details. We gave just enough that we can talk about it, process it together. So I'd like us to process together with the group, and I would like input from the group. So our first question is, what observations do you have or do you make, and we have a spelling error or wrong word here, what observations do you make about Frank's relationship with God? As you read this story, what would be some things just a little bit that you would observe about Frank's relationship with God? I have 3 volunteers who would come up and give your input. If you volunteer, just come on up here and we'll just have you share one at a time. We'll just take time to. Sure, call on 3.
No, go ahead.
Well, this comes as a surprise, but my observation would be that Frank has slowly let something come between him and his relationship with God and with his wife and family, and has let it probably unknowingly affect his relationships. And I'm not exactly sure what the answer is.
So he lets the problem come in between his relationship, between him and God, like Rodney said, and he's not taking care of it. So he must not be talking to God on a daily basis. One of the other sessions we heard about how that verse was brought out, let not the sun go down upon thy wrath, and so I think that was probably a key thing he missed, taking care of his anger as when the sun goes down, and not taking it on to the next day, and it grows. It seemed like it grew from there. So,
Thank you.
Well, yeah, they kind of said what I was thinking. Basically, coming on slowly, allowing it to slowly deteriorate, his relationship with God is slowly deteriorating. Just allowing that to grow and to build and to boil, and not taking it to God and being at peace, and that just slowly destroys relationships.
Good. Men did very good. Yeah, and so as we think about what these men shared, what's important, our whole topic, this seminar has been on relationships, and so as we think about that, our relationship with God is very important in relationships, because one thing we can conclude, Frank has allowed, something has come into his life that is slowly eroding his relationship with God, and automatically in our story that transfers over to other relationships that happen. It automatically affects him and his wife's relationship, him and the children's relationship, him and the church's relationship. So just the importance of that for each one of us to daily keep our relationship with God up. What's that look like? To daily talk to God, allow God to talk to me. One thing I was challenged with recently in talking about relationship with God is Tim Weaver, a former administrator, he challenged us staff men, to pray to God for 10 minutes and don't ask for anything. Did you ever try that? That's hard. Because I'm selfish enough. I go to prayer. I think I need this. I need to tell God about this, and He needs to deal with this, and I need help with this. But to go pray and don't ask for anything for 10 minutes, it's hard. But it exposed my wrong focus of prayer. So I would encourage you all with that. In your relationship with God, try it. Try praying for 10 minutes and don't ask God for anything. Just thank and praise Him and don't ask for anything. That'd be one encouragement I would have. Okay, let's look at the second one. If you were the pastor, what questions would you ask Frank? So in our story, Laura finally confides in the pastor's wife some of her fears, and Frank is just like a lot of us men are. We're self-sufficient, and to ask for help means we're weak, and we don't like that, and so anyhow, the pastor comes to talk with him. So if you were his pastor, what would be some questions you would have asked Frank? Anybody want to volunteer to give input on that question? Good, come on up here. Come on up here so we can record it and they can hear it. Come on up here. Yeah, come on up here. They're recording us and they want to be able to hear what you said. So, somebody else come on up too while he's talking. We have another volunteer.
I just thought I'd ask him why he waited 2 years before he did anything about it.
Good question. Okay, thank you. That's a good question. Okay. Somebody else, come on up if you have a thought on it.
Well, I definitely don't know what would be the appropriate thing to do or ask, but I thought that came to me was I'd probably start out asking if he would say, or what his opinion would be, has your relationship with your wife deteriorated in the past number of years? What about your relationship with God? Has it deteriorated?
Sure.
And then try to identify why, get them to think and reason, or just think about that, and then identify what happened, what took place, and why it started to deteriorate, and go from there.
Very good, thank you.
Well, I had a few thoughts on this. I thought I might share. I am aware of at least 2 situations exactly like that. Now, I shouldn't say exactly. I'm not sure how it's affecting their marriage or anything like that. But I do know of some businessmen that did not get paid, and fairly large sums. And I believe the way they expressed it to me was they have decided they are just going to go on without it. You know, my thought was in the end, at Judgment Day, what is it going to matter to me, you know? But we do need to forgive, or it will affect our spiritual life. We heard a lot in these meetings what is important to us. And I think our relationship with God came out many, many times. That is the important thing. That is what we need to keep number one, not our financial things.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else have any input on that question? Any questions that you would ask Frank? Probably a question that, these are all good. You men had good questions to ask. A question I would probably have asked him is how he feels about the whole situation. What's Frank's feelings in his view? Where's he at with all this? Not being paid, and yeah, how's he feel about that? Obviously his actions are saying that he has feelings about that, but to hear him express that would have been a good question to ask. Okay, question number 3. What are some biblical steps the pastor may have shared with Frank? We didn't give that information purposely because we want to talk about what we want to raise the question. What would be, we just said that the pastor did give some, but what do you think, if you were in the pastor's shoes, what would be some biblical steps that you could give Frank? If you have some thoughts on that, come on right up here to the mic. And more of you can come up here and line up if you have something. Be fun. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I believe one of the things that Frank allowed to come into his life and grow is bitterness. And bitterness is a serious thing. It has roots, and it loves to be fed. And then, on top of that, if Frank wants to reach out to God for help and is carrying bitterness, his prayers are hindered. He has lost a connection. Mm-hmm. And so I believe the pastor would possibly have to go right to the root of the problem. Maybe.
Okay. Some more. Come on up, Wayne.
Well, I'm a little scared here. I feel like I'm one of the younger ones, probably. Maybe not, I don't know. But I know Brian here, and I wanted to go up and help out in this discussion. As far as biblical steps, well, there was already mentioned that that the deterioration started with relationship with God deteriorate, and then other things deteriorate. So, I guess what was in my mind, what I was thinking was that to go back and start with rebuilding relationship with God, and then let that work out into the other relationships. Because, and number one is to keep a relationship, a daily relationship with God, with a devotional, and that can be crowded out very easily, especially for pressures and all that. But yeah, that's what I would say. Start with a relationship with God, and then probably to his wife, and then to others, and the situation, the financial situation we don't know how that would work out, but that's something that. If I put myself in Frank's shoes, if I have my relationship with God what it should be, the best I can, well, then I've done my part.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you. Anybody else? Somebody else? I know we have lots of wisdom out here in the audience. I'm convinced of that.
Well, as I thought of this situation, my mind kind of went to some of the biblical steps that are set in the Bible for these types of situations. And I believe, like Matthew 18 would say, that if a brother or someone offends you, that you should go to him. So I guess I would have thought maybe the first thing he could have done was go back to this Christian brother, maybe not in the church, their church, but the Christian brother, and seen what he could have done for him. And then it goes on, and if they won't hear you, then take 2 or 3 more, and try to work in those steps. So that'd be my thoughts.
Very good. Okay. Someone else? Buddy, any more thoughts? Any more steps that you could give Frank? Biblical steps you could give Frank here in this situation? I think the brother here who shared about Matthew 18, I think that was a good point. That would be a good initial step, just to go talk to the fellow, maybe take somebody with him. Yeah, that'd be a good step. Some other steps I thought about would be to, where is Frank at with, does he recognize his anger and how that's impacting his wife and children? Like somebody mentioned that. Be a step for him to take one step. The first step would be for him to take a look at that, be willing to consider that. And maybe another step would be for him to talk with Laura about it, just have a conversation with her. She's fearful in talking about it, so apparently in the story they don't talk much about it. So for another step would be to encourage Frank to talk with Laura about it. Okay, some good input there, thank you. Question number 4, how can Laura encourage Frank? What would be some things that Laura could do to encourage Frank? Obviously, in the story she did, at least one thing, she was encouraging him to go talk to the pastor. But what would be some other practical, everyday things that Laura could do to encourage Frank? It could be, yep. Could be. I didn't hear. What did you say? Somebody? Oh, he asked if this is a lady's question. I said it possibly, yes, probably it is. We might not have ladies that feel comfortable being up here, but maybe you men know what your wife would think, or maybe she can tell you and you can come up, however that works. I thought about one thing, and while you're thinking about this, I'll just mention one thing. So in our story, what's the one thing that Laura starts to do? She starts to withdraw, right? It says that in her story. She feels herself withdrawing because of her fear. So one step she could take would be to engage Frank. To not withdraw from him, but to pursue him. Maybe that's the right word. To engage in conversation, engage in relationship. What else? I'm sure there's other things. Come on up. Oh, come on up. We'll take 2 of you, take 3 of you, 4 of you. How many of them? This is open discussion. This is where we learn.
Well, I guess I was thinking she could encourage him not to become angry and encourage him to communicate. Brian already mentioned that, but be open to communicate and work through the situation.
I had a little story that I wanted to say that would probably fit in any one of these. First off, my wife and I just said that Frank didn't say in the story that Frank had a relationship with God. It didn't mention that he had a relationship with God first. However, being that he was raised in an Anabaptist home, he probably, knew what was required or how he. Anyway, I just wanted to say there, it says, how can Laura encourage Frank? And it was a situation that I had with the tire store I owned. For a number of years, I had a customer that came in and I sold him a set of tires. And the customer would always get a free rotation and flat repair with a set of tires. And so every 5,000 miles, he could come back and get a free rotation. However, the guy lived not too far down the road. I knew the guy, and he came back for his rotations and hadn't paid his bill yet. And I struggled a bit with this, that I was already giving him free rotations and he hasn't paid his bill yet. And I talked to my wife, and actually he came in one time when my wife was there. And she overheard the story. She was in the office, you know, and I rotated his tires and he went on his way. And by and by, time went on and he quit coming back. And I struggled with John. John's his name. Sorry, people that whose name is John out here, but however, it was John. And I drove by his house every time. Every time I went to work, every day I went to work, I drove past John's house. And finally, my wife, I couldn't help but, oh, there's John. Finally, my wife said, you know, I should pray for John every time I go by his house. And I thought, maybe I should. So we're required to forgive. So maybe Frank should have, you know, it doesn't say that, you know, if he was working on forgiving the guy who owed him the money. However, I decided I'm going to have to forgive John. And even though I was driving, I had to make an effort, a special effort, to pray for John when I went by there, every time I went by there. So that would be a way that Laura might encourage Frank, the way my wife did.
Thank you very much. That's good. Thank you. Somebody else? We have another one here.
Well, I had to think of when they were saying how it doesn't say that, well, I lost my train of thought, other than that Frank, it says that he was born and raised in an Anabaptist home, and he's hardworking, and I think, right, it says he's self-sufficient. And I guess kind of going over all of them, that were his relationship with God wasn't, well, like it says, he was an Anabaptist. He was raised in an Anabaptist home, but then down here for Laura, I felt that she should remember her marriage vows, that she committed to be his helpmeet and to walk beside him and encourage him. Maybe we think of take his hand and instead of withdrawing, to even though it's maybe a struggle when one is maybe kind of giving the cold shoulder, but her duty is to walk beside and her self-sufficient man.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on to the next question here. This would be a good question for us men. How does Frank work through his shame of feeling exposed? And so us men probably struggle with that a lot, in being self-sufficient and feeling like we can handle this, and we can, you know, if somebody has to help us, that somehow points to weakness. So how could we help? How does Frank work through his shame of feeling exposed? Anybody have any thoughts on that question? Come on up. Maybe we could even think about the concept that Ben taught us, a proper self-perception, or a distorted here, but how does that play into this? Does it at all? is it an accurate perception that for Frank to ask for help is weakness? Is that a proper perception?
Well, in this question, I guess we heard about idols, and I'm afraid he had an idol there, pride. We need to crucify self and get rid of this pride so that we can effectively take advice from others and lay down the hurts that we've received from others. I'm sure there's more that have better thoughts, but that was the course that I was thinking.
Thank you. Someone else?
So I see Frank here, I see him as a businessman, but he might be a little weak in some areas, and something that he didn't practice quite as much, and so that's probably one he didn't hopefully have to exercise too often. But for Frank, I would tell him that, well, Frank, when you pull into somebody's place, you got to remember that this may not work out. Every time you pull into somebody's place, you're at the risk of this, every time, 100% of the time. And because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. So you kind of need to be aware that and understand that this is always an option. So then when you go ahead and do business and you get paid, that's really a nice benefit. That's just a plus. And supposed to keep on?
Go ahead, keep on.
So a fella asked me one time, he said, well, it looks pretty good here. And that was a long time ago. I said, well, what you want a good tax man, and you want a good bookkeeper, tax man, and you want a good banker that understands your business, and then you always want one other person that you can go to, whatever the situation is. And that person may revolve. That might be a different person. So that's what I tell Frank.
Okay, good. Okay, someone else?
So when he becomes exposed, all of a sudden he realizes he's not in control anymore.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Well, this is very good. This is how we learn. Whenever we take a real life story and we talk about it, process it, and how do we apply biblical truth to these situations, because this is where we live. Okay, someone else want to give some thoughts to that question? Okay, we'll go to the last one. What biblical instruction could the pastor's wife give Laura in relating to Frank? What biblical instruction could the pastor's wife give Laura in relating to Frank? Someone give us some advice on that question. Thank you.
I think one of the most powerful weapons, but also the most underused weapon, is that of prayer. And we usually wait to really pray until we don't know what else to do. And so maybe that's where she should start.
Good advice. Someone else?
The scripture says that the wife is to be subject to her husband. And I've read books that they're even expected to be subject to them even if their husband is angry or not feeling as a Christian. And I think if the pastor's wife would have encouraged Laura to be subject to him and try to encourage him would be biblical.
Okay. Let's have one more yet. Good, we'll take both of you. We'll take two. We got plenty of time.
The thought that came to me was, and I don't have it quite accurate, but Scripture talks about the wife. If she has an unbelieving husband, she's supposed to teach him by her conversation, by her life. So if she could, well, prayer would be a big step, but if she could somehow teach him by something that comes to her in something similar, that she could respond in the right way so that he could learn from that.
The scripture says in 1 Peter that the wife is to reverence her husband as Sarah did and call him Lord. Frank needs to know that his wife still thinks he's the man. He's a self-sufficient man, according to this, and she needs to honor that, respect that, and let him know that she still loves him, cares for him, even through all this situation. The shame of being exposed to Frank is real. I'm not sure how many of you here could put your name there where Frank is, but I think I could. Now, I didn't have this same experience happen, but similar ones. And the encouragement and the love of a wife goes a long way. It says in Ephesians 5 that the husband is to love the wife as Christ loved the church, and the wife is to reverence her husband. Those two go together all the time. In our marriage vows, we promise to love, to cherish in health, in sickness, in prosperity, and adversity. It doesn't matter what the situation. So I think the Bible instruction is there. We need to follow it and make it practical in our own experience.
Okay, anybody else? Anyone else would like to share? Is there anyone here who would have a question that we didn't, maybe a question that you would have liked to ask about this story that we didn't ask? You'd be free to come up and ask that, and we would talk about it. Give you opportunity for that here. Good.
So I would have two questions. One being, was it right for his wife, for Laura, to go to the pastor's wife in the first place? And then the next question is, what is a pastor supposed to do with this situation?
All right, what do we think? Let's just take the first one first. Was it right for Laura to go and express her fears to the pastor's wife? Was that a wrong approach? Somebody have some thoughts? Gerald.
I say this for fear of being misunderstood and maybe disagreed with, but I think she was right. She did this to save her family and her marriage and herself and her husband. She sought help, I think, at the proper place.
Okay, someone else? Anybody else? Any thoughts? Okay, we'll take the second part of his question. How'd you ask that? What should the pastor do with this situation? Yeah. So Laura comes to his wife. I think if I understand your question right, you're saying she comes to him, then what's he supposed to do? Okay. So if you were a pastor, or let's put ourselves in the pastor's shoes, Laura comes to your wife and she shares her fears. And now what are you to do? Let's have some thoughts on that question. Two volunteers, or maybe we'll just have one. Does somebody volunteer to give a thought on that question? Floyd, why don't you come up and answer that question?
I was thinking probably my suggestion would be that the pastor would call Frank and ask him if him and his wife could come over some evening and they could sit down and talk, or have a meeting somewhere and just sit down and talk. And I know meetings can get sometimes meetings can get out of hand or be, but if he does it with the right approach, just sit down, talk, what's going on, ask questions, I think that would be a good place to start for them, just to sit down and have a open communication, offer that we'd like, the pastor would offer that, we'd like to help you if there's anything we can help, and just offer encouragement and let Frank know that we're here for you if there's anything we can do.
Thank you, Floyd. And our story says here that the pastor did assure him that he's going to walk with him. So I think, the pastor from the story here listens well. We could dissect, did Laura do the right thing by going? In those situations, we don't always just do everything perfect. I think we have to do the right thing and do it with a good heart, and which I get the feeling from this story that Laura, her heart wasn't to run Frank down. Her heart was to help, and that was her goal. And the pastor, you know, as a shepherd, I don't think he can let this go. If he knows he's responsible, he's going to go check it out, and he did. I think he fulfilled his responsibility. He went to see what was happening. Okay. Well, very good. Yeah, I've enjoyed the discussion. It's been a good time to learn, and I've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you all for participating and making this a successful discussion.